The Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. Today is Maundy Thursday, and we're going to get into a discussion about that and one of the cries for anguish for the Christ from the cross as Pastor Rob is preparing for Good Friday evening service at 6:30 this coming Friday. If you haven't already, sign up for the Holy Week text. You can find that on social media, and also if you have any trouble signing up for that, go ahead and email us at podcast@shepnaz.org, and we'll make sure you get taken care of. So welcome in, Pastor Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about the texting. We've done it a couple years. We've added a few things to it this year, but it's kind of like a breaking news thing as things happen as they would have happened in Jesus' life, and just during the day, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, just as a reminder of everything that's going on in the spiritual realm. So it's pretty cool.
Even though I help on the backside of preparing those texts, I sign up myself to get those texts.
Yeah.
And even though I know they're coming and I already know what they're going to say, I have found that when it hits me in the middle of the day while I'm doing something else in my regular day, it just comes at you a different way.
Yeah,
and
Well, and I'm the same way. I wrote them, and it's like, right. When it comes to you, you're like, oh man.
This would have been happening then.
Yep, exactly.
So we're getting ready for Good Friday service, which is this Friday at 6:30 here at Kahana campus. Tell us a little bit about what you're looking into.
Yeah, so we're in this series called Christ from the Cross, and when Jesus was on the cross, if you take all four of the Gospels together, there are 7 things that Jesus said while he was hanging on the cross, and we're looking at some of those. We looked already a couple of weeks ago when Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Last Sunday, we talked about the thieves that were on both sides of Jesus and the conversation that occurred on the cross when Jesus said, "Today you'll be with me in paradise," because one of the thieves asked him to remember him. And what we're going to be talking about on Good Friday is the third thing that Jesus said, which was some incredibly powerful words. And we see that this actually, what we're going to be talking about is the fourth thing that Jesus said. The third thing that Jesus said was he spoke to his mother and was talking to one of the disciples about making sure to take care of his mother. But this fourth phrase is very interesting. It's found in Matthew 27, 45 and 46. And it says this: "From the 6th hour, which was noon, until the 9th hour, which was 3 o'clock, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?'" So a couple of things about that. First of all, it talks about the 6th hour, and we would typically think, oh, that's 6 o'clock, but the Jewish day began at 6 a.m. And so when it says in the Bible at the 6th hour, it's starting at 6 a.m. And so this would have happened at noon. And so we know that there's kind of like a timeline of the events that happened. And so Jesus from 9 o'clock to noon was forced to carry his cross, and the crucifixion occurs. And so all these things that are happening now are happening during daylight. And then at noon, from noon to 3 o'clock, because it says from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, which would be noon to 3, darkness falls over the whole land. And then Jesus is silent and doesn't cry out anything during this period of time. But then at 3 o'clock, after he's been literally hanging on the cross for at least 3 hours, if not more, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And to me, this is maybe one of the most powerful things that Jesus says when he's on the cross, because there's a lot behind it. Yeah. And if we just read that, we're just thinking, oh, God's being mean. He didn't save him from it. But there's so much going on in the background, and it's so theologically rich. And so what's really actually happening here is Jesus is becoming our sacrifice. And it mimics the sacrifices that were being offered in the temple. And so if I could just really quick kind of share with you the anatomy of a sacrifice, or how in the temple, when a sinner brought a sacrifice for the priest to offer on their part for their sin, there was a lot that went on. And so kind of like 4 stages of that sacrifice. The first one is that this sinner brings an animal without defect to the altar. So when you would bring, say you're living back then and you know that you have sin in your life, you have to offer this sacrifice. You bring an animal, but the animal that you were required to bring was the one without defect. So you couldn't bring the weakest animal in your flock. You couldn't bring one that had any problems or it was older. You're going to get rid of it anyway. It literally was to be your best sacrifice, your best animal. And so the sinner would bring that animal without defect to the altar, and then the sinner would lay his hands on the head of the animal. And so in Leviticus 4:4, it says he must bring the bull to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle, lay his hand on the bull's head. And so I'm bringing this sacrifice to the temple. And then when I get there and I'm before the priest, I place my hands on the head of the animal. And what this act literally represents is the guilt that I have in my life for the sins that I've committed is now being transferred to the animal. And so now the animal bears the guilt of my sin. And that's a powerful thing. And we'll talk about what that means here later. And then the animal would be killed. And so in Leviticus 4:4, it goes on, he must bring the bull to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle, lay his hand on the bull's head, and then slaughter it before the Lord. And of course, it's a gruesome process. And, on the Day of Atonement and the day on Passover time, there was just blood running through the gutters of the city of Jerusalem because of the amount of sacrifices that were being made. But it was a gruesome process because God wanted it to be a reminder to the people that sin was a very serious offense. It wasn't just like, you sin and it's no big deal. And we may do that today and think, oh, that was no big deal. But spiritually, it was a really big deal because it offended God. It separated us in our relationship with him. And so this blood was a reminder to the people that sin was serious. And if every time we sinned, we knew that there would be some kind of animal sacrifice that was required, and an animal was going to lose its life and shed its blood, we might take sin a little bit more seriously and certainly keep us from taking it so light. But we do take it light. But anyway, this was why this was such a process. Now, part of that also is that God required the exchange of blood for the forgiveness of our sins. And so when God forgives a person of their sins, it isn't just, he just like looks over it and says, no big deal, don't worry about it. It has to be paid for. Like the system that is set up is that there has to be someone pay for the sin for it to be forgiven. In the Old Testament sacrificial system, it was a sacrifice of an animal. In Leviticus 17:11, it says, the life of the body is in its blood, and I have given you the blood on the altar to purify you, making you right with the Lord. It is the blood given in exchange for a life that makes purification possible. So we know that the reason that God can forgive a person is if blood has been shed. That's how serious it is. Like God wouldn't, and by the way he set it up, can't just say, I forgive you, don't worry about it, no big deal, unless there's a sacrifice made, right? Hebrews 9:22, it says, the law requires that everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So if I'm living back in those days prior to Jesus' crucifixion, and I've sinned, I've offended God, my relationship with God is broken. In order for me to have my sins forgiven and my relationship with God restored, I take an animal from my flock, or I buy one at a high price, and I bring it to the priest, and I lay my hands on the head of this animal, signifying the transfer of my sin onto the animal, and then it's slaughtered. It's like there's a whole very particular way that it's done, but the blood is shed, and then the blood is poured or sprinkled on the altar as required, and then it burns, and then there's the smoke and the incense of that. It would be not a very great smell, and they said that, around those times when there were sacrifices being offered in Jerusalem at these holy days and festivals, you could smell it from a long ways away, but then the blood would be poured or sprinkled on the altar as God required. So in Leviticus 4, it says the high priest would take some of the bull's blood into the tabernacle, dip his finger in the blood, sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the inner curtain of the sanctuary. Priest would then put some of the blood on the horns of the altar for fragrant incense that stands in the Lord's presence inside the tabernacle. So this is the system that was in place prior to Jesus' crucifixion, right? And so this is how a person would get their sins forgiven. And of course, we talked last week about how this system, the blood of these animals, didn't have the power to take away sins. It only covered sin. But it was the system that God had put in place. And so to obey the system and to submit to it was that God would credit your acts as righteousness. And what's happening in the cross is that God is ushering in a new and a better system. And this system is so important that it's going to be a sacrifice that lasts once and for all. So again, the old sacrificial system would only cover a person's sin. Hebrews 10:4-5 says it's not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. That is why when Christ came into the world, he said, you didn't want animal sacrifices or sin offerings, but you've given me a body to offer. So Jesus knew he was coming as a sacrifice, right? And the sacrifice that Jesus was offering once and for all was different than the sacrifices that would be offered over and over again. His sacrifice had the power to remove sins. And so in Hebrews 10:11, it says, under the old covenant, the priest stands and ministers before the altar day after day, offering the same sacrifices again and again, which can never take away sins. It would cover the sins, but it would not take them away. But then it says, our high priest, referring to Jesus, offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time, and then he sat down in the place of honor at God's right hand. So what's happening on the cross is symbolic of what used to happen in the temple over and over and over again. And God finally says, enough of that. I'm going to offer one perfect sacrifice once and for all. And this sacrifice is so powerful that it has the power to take sins away, not just to cover over them. And so this is kind of the thing that's happening on the cross. And so it's an incredibly powerful picture. And we'll talk about this some more tomorrow. But what God is literally doing is mimicking what has happened in the temple for a long time, and it's happening now in the spiritual realm on the cross. And when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We know that something in the spiritual realm happened that has never happened before, and we'll talk about that tomorrow.
Great. And before we leave today being actually what we refer to as Maundy Thursday, for many, I don't know if you're not familiar with the church, you hear the term of Passover as we're talking about, the kind of the Easter week. And maybe people don't realize where Passover came from originally. Yeah. Like even prior to the Mosaic law, when we were given all these systems of sacrifices, it ultimately goes all the way back to when they were in exile in Egypt and in slavery, and they were waiting to be delivered out of Egypt. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to take maybe a couple minutes and kind of talk about the Passover originally, and then that happens to be what's also happening the week before his death.
Right. So when Jesus rides into town on Palm Sunday, it signals the beginning of a Passover week, which is a celebration that honored what God did when they were in exile in Egypt. And so, as you know, the Egyptian or the Israelites were in bondage to the Egyptians, and they were slaves, and God had said it's time for them to be free, and he sent Moses to set them free. And Moses goes before Pharaoh time and time again, and there are many plagues that came on trying to convince Pharaoh to let God's people go, and he wouldn't do it. He said he would, then he reneged and came back on it and everything. And finally, this last one was God said that what I'm going to have you do is this. And so he went to Moses and he said, I want you to have all of the Israelites take a lamb and sacrifice it, and take the blood of that lamb and put it over the doorposts of your home, or on the doorposts of your home. And that night, an angel of death was coming into Egypt, and he was going to kill the firstborn of every household unless there was blood on the doorpost. And if there was blood on the doorpost, the angel of death would pass over that house and go to the next house. So all of Israel did this. And so when they celebrate the Passover, they're celebrating the fact that when the angel of death came into Egypt to set them free, the angel passed over all of the Israelites because they had sacrificed an animal, put the blood on the doorpost. But there was, in the Egyptian homes, they didn't do that, of course, and they all lost the firstborn, and Pharaoh actually lost his firstborn son. And that was the final straw where Pharaoh says, all right, you get out of here. I don't want you here anymore. Right. And then the Exodus begins, right? They move from slavery to being free people eventually, because they went round and round in the desert for a while. But that was the beginning. So this Passover is a reminder of the fact that God had delivered them and that because of their obedience, they didn't pay the consequences that the Egyptians did for not obeying as well. So that's what they're celebrating now. And it just so interesting that this is like the peak of Israel's holy days, right?
Yeah.
They're celebrating this, and there's a certain way they have a Passover meal, which was what Jesus was eating with the disciples when we call it the Last Supper. And all these things are happening. And so it's like there's just such heightened spiritual activity going on in the Israel at this time. And on top of all that, Jesus is being crucified, right? And then we know how the Old Testament sacrificial system worked, and now Jesus is offering himself as a sacrifice once and for all. While nobody really got that at that moment, when Jesus speaks and we understand what he meant, we'll see what was actually happening in the spiritual realm.
All right, so tomorrow we're going to get into what Jesus said after 3 hours of darkness and what is the significance there. We're already got a little bit of a picture of the reason he's making this sacrifice. It's to pay for our sins once and forever. In the meantime, before tomorrow, you can check out everything that's going on in the church by going to shepnaz.org. Once again, we encourage you to sign up for the Holy Week text, and also you can check out everything on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.